For anybody that doesn't know who Eric Clarke is, why don't you give us a quick couple sentences about who you are, what you do, and where you're from?
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. It's an honor. I'll tell you, compared to some of the other individuals you've interviewed, I would put myself in that camp of everyday explorer as opposed to being an extreme athlete by any stretch of the imagination. At my core, I'm an entrepreneur. I love helping people solve problems, starting businesses. And right now, I'm the CEO of a business called Orion. We employ just over 1,400 members of our team and support just over $3.5 trillion of assets on our technology platform, helping advisors leave their brokerage firms and wirehouses and go out on their own as an independent fiduciary doing the right thing for their clients. And so I like to explain it simply by, we have technology that supports the right side of Wall Street, so to speak, helping those advisors who are also entrepreneurial in nature support their investors on their journey to retirement or whatever extreme financial goals they may have that the advisor's up for helping them out with. But while all that's been going on, I've been a long time distance runner. I would say I've done a fair bit of hiking and things like that. Really, maybe, right as equal to my passion, so to speak, at running the business.
Okay. That's really helpful. And if I remember our previous conversations, you pretty much started Orion from scratch with 0 customers. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is right. So I was running the IT and operations group for kind of a mid-sized RIA firm in the mid to late 90s. And we were looking for technology to better support our business. And we couldn't find the technology that we needed off the shelf. So I put together a business plan, and actually we split the companies apart and created the company that today is Orion back in December of 1999. So while I started the business as an online service technology platform back in the late 90s and certainly the very early 2000s, doing business online wasn't completely conventional. Yep. So we were a bit outside the box then as we got started. And as doing business online, financial transactions and looking up account values and information became more acceptable to do those activities online, then our business was really positioned for the future and positioned to grow.
Yeah. So you said a minute ago, you're not maybe one of the extreme explorers, but that kind of entrepreneurship is not for the faint of heart. So you've taken a fair amount of risk over the last 20 some years to do that. And yeah, my experience with Orion, you guys and you specifically have always kind of had your thoughts where the puck was going, not necessarily where it currently was.
Yeah. And talking about it today, it's exciting and it's been this great opportunity for us. However, when we were starting out, we were really solving problems that we had. What was essentially some of the greatest frustration that I had certainly experienced in my professional career up to that time became this wonderful opportunity to create a solution that really didn't exist in the marketplace. And I think so often in life, things are all about how we frame them, right? So yeah. Is this a challenge? Is this a problem? Or is this an opportunity? And keeping in mind, when life gives us challenges, hey, this can be a great opportunity and a blessing in my life. That's really, really important. And having that type of optimism, I think, can really shape our future destiny.
Yeah, that's really an interesting thought, that the mindset that you have on the business side. I'm interested to hear how that maybe has translated into some of the more difficult things that you've done. But I guess my direct question right now is that mindset thinking, did you have to nurture that in yourself, or did you find that to be that optimism and having the right framework? Did that come natural to you?
I would say no, right? I mean, I just growing up, I remember spending a lot of time with my father. He was an investment advisor, and we were running essentially a family run investment advisory business. As kids, we were, involved in the business, whether that was in high school, coming in and making cold calls, or even, you know, providing the janitorial services for the office, things like that. We really started out working, but I remember along the way, we'd be doing projects, whatever that was for the business, and we would get the easy part done. And, my father used to tell me, okay, now you've done the easy part, and now I need you to keep going and, solve the problem or finish the job, so to speak, that we were given to do. And, that mindset, I know this podcast is about adventure and exploring and things like that, but that mindset of saying, okay, I think I've gotten this to about where everyone else would normally take this. Now let's do the hard part. Let's push past
Yep.
that and see where else we can take this.
Yeah, and that's a skill set that has to be practiced. So it sounds like you were able to practice that in a work setting, but easily translate that. Well, I should say translate it. I don't know how easily it translated, but into some of these more strenuous things outdoors that you'll tell us about. Let me kind of stay in that early years mode with you. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but you went to BYU undergrad and University of Utah for grad school?
That's correct. Yep. And the whole time I was in school, even back in high school, I was a distance swimmer. And, my father was always encouraging me and my siblings to start some type of a business, even starting small. My older brother, Todd, had a lawn mowing business. My brother, Scott, and we had looked at that lawn mowing business and we said, that's a lot of work. We'd help him. We'd work for him in the summers and mowing, 30 yards a week was a lot of
That's
work.
tough.
And so we decided instead that we would start a swimming lesson business. And
Okay.
we continued doing that every summer. Even when I was in grad school, my brother Scott was in med school, we'd still get back together and we'd do swimming lessons. The last summer that we did that, it had been, I think, about 8 years that we did that together. We had just over 500 kids that
Oh
we
my
worked with
gosh.
that last summer. So it ended up being this big business. I'll tell you, thinking about that now, we had some very patient and supportive neighbors, and certainly, patient and supportive parents as well, because we completely monopolized their pool from sun up to sundown, doing swim lessons, but really learned a lot through that experience about, starting a business, dealing with customers,
Sure.
making sure that we were providing a service that would create results, those types of things. And so it was a great learning experience. And then after finishing up grad school, jumping back into the family business, full time, the investment advisory business, it really, it was a great thing, because I recognized, hey, I can run and start my own business, and I see another opportunity to do something here to solve a very significant challenge that we were facing at that time.
That is cool. One thing I've learned is we never make a financial decision in a vacuum, or a life decision. There's always these either previous ripple effects to get you to that spot, or ripple effects in front of the decision. And I can see the way those markers lined up for you to get to what is now Orion.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Now, the few long distance swimmers that I know are a unique breed, to say it nicely, but incredible athletes, and that translate into other types of athletic ventures. So do you still swim? And did you find that as an easy way to transition to some other sort of athletic activities that you do now?
Exactly. Being a distance swimmer, you're right. A lot of hours in the pool, a lot of laps, taught me a lot. I think that mental stamina, having that mindset of, okay, now I've done the easy part, now I got to finish this,
Mhm.
definitely applied there. But when I was in college, I had recognized pretty quickly that the distance swimming wasn't going to be something I was going to continue to do at a competitive level. So I had a couple of roommates who were preparing to run the Las Vegas Marathon. And I thought, you know what? I'm not swimming right now. So why not run with them? And they were like, okay, well, do you want to, have you done this before? No. Would you like to do a half? I said, well, are you guys doing a half? They said, no, we're doing the full thing, full marathon. I said, then I'll just do that. And I remember my one roommate saying to me, you haven't run a 5K yet. You haven't done anything. Are you sure you want to do this? I said, absolutely. So I trained side by side with them and really learned that anyone can run a marathon as long as you train properly for it. Had an absolute blast running with them and found out that running was a lot of fun compared to swimming those laps in the pool. And really, that's where my love for running began, so to speak.
Interesting. Do you do any swimming at all now, or was it a all or nothing kind of thing?
Occasionally, a couple of times a month, I'll hop in the pool and still do some laps. Not as much as I wish I did, but just really fell in love with running. I think during the pandemic, like most people, we got a Peloton, a bike, got into that, but then I got one of those Peloton treadmills. I absolutely love that because I find myself doing something completely ridiculous on a treadmill that I would never do, on my own. And having having a coach or having a roommate that is helping pace you, or a partner, that's where I think we really often find, hey, I can do so much more than I thought I could, on my own. I can push myself in a variety of different ways here.
Yeah, that's something I've explored in these conversations is what impact does the human connection have on this adventure experience? And to what you're saying, the pacer or the coach can push you beyond what you thought you could do. But I've also had people tell me that when they think back on the experiences, and one guy, hiked to the summit of Kilimanjaro, and what he remembered about that was not the summit experience necessarily. It was the people that he was with through the whole experience.
For sure.
That really highlighted. And that's what I hear you saying with that marathon. And the few trips that I know that you've taken, you've done it in groups. Has that been pretty consistent for you?
Yeah. So we've done, I say we, my wife has done several of these with me, but I've done over 6 trips that are called excellent adventures. And these excellent adventures have, taken us on some really fun hikes, but we've done those, within essentially a continuous time frame. So we've done things that people might normally take, 2 or 3 days to accomplish. We usually are starting about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we go until we're finished. And they've ranged from 20-mile hikes to 30-mile hikes with a fair bit of elevation, gain, incline and decline, and it's been an absolute blast. I think of those experiences very similarly to how I think of the 12 or 13 marathons that I've run, in that, I basically train myself just like I'm going to run a marathon for one of those excellent adventures, just to make sure I'm mentally and physically prepared for that,
Yeah. And I would imagine whether it's swimming long distance or running a marathon or doing a 30-mile through hike, that there gets a moment in that experience where your brain is telling you that you need to stop, that something bad is going to happen if you continue on, but you continue on and you complete the journey. And one of the things I've tried to explore with these conversations is, what do you say to yourself when you get to that point, that dark night of the soul, kind of pain cave moment? Do you have a mantra that you go to? Is it just kind of positive self-talk? What do you do to keep your legs moving forward?
Yeah, this is a great question, and something that mentally, before I get into the event, this is how I look at it. At some point in all the marathons that I've run, between mile 18 and 22, you have that moment where it would feel appropriate to stop. And at that point, that's where I tell myself, okay, this is where this event begins. I'm just starting. So
Mm,
let's do
I
this.
see.
Let's see if we can make it happen. And I really will tell people that are thinking about running a marathon, I always tell them, okay, the race starts at mile 18. You've
Mhm.
got 8 to go. And that's where you got to dig deep. You're going to have an hour or hour and 15 minutes there where it's going to be, that's where, things begin to get tough. It physically begins to get very difficult. And that's where mentally I tell myself, this is where this race begins. So everything up to that point is essentially a warm up. Now, I know that sounds
Okay.
ridiculous, an 18-mile warm up, but in life, that's what whether it's running, swimming, or even something, a challenge that we're facing, professionally, that's my mindset where it switches. And I say, okay, you know what? I understand this is difficult. I understand this is painful. This is hard. This is a point where you feel like giving up. And that's where mentally I like to just tell myself, this is where this begins. This is where
Got
it
it.
starts. Yep.
That's back to the mindset that you mentioned early on.
This is where it
Um,
matters.
yeah, that mindset or framing the situation in a way that it sounds like it inspires you to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But you had to be prepared for that mindset. It's not something you could get to mile 18 and go, okay, now what do I do?
100% agree.
Yeah, that's really cool. What is when you think back on your childhood, before getting into these types of things, even before swimming, what's the first thing that you remember that was really strenuous or outside of your comfort zone?
I was involved in the Boy Scouts. I eventually became an Eagle Scout right before my 16th birthday. But scouting was tough. It was essentially your first nights away from home without the comforts of home. And, oftentimes you were faced with strenuous physical activities and during the day, and at night you're exhausted but still able to have some fun. But I really do think of that journey that I went through to become an Eagle Scout as kind of that first difficult thing that I was able to successfully accomplish and achieve, that really set me up to do some other difficult things in life.
Yeah,
um,
that makes sense. Now, before you did that first outdoor trip or the first uncomfortable thing, what pushed you to do that? What was it like getting to that moment? And it may be your parents said that's what you're going to do. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to
Oh, yeah.
explore a little bit.
My father definitely was involved into the scouting
Okay.
program and highly encouraged us in a variety of different ways to be engaged in scouting. But, to your point, there was a lot of preparation that goes up into that moment, right? The
Yeah.
scout motto of be prepared, starts well in advance of when you actually face the challenge of your first camp out, or
Yeah.
getting those 20 nights of camping in, that type of thing. The one thing that was especially fun for me is that with my son, when he was, growing up, is to go through it all over again, side by side with him. And, scouting, it really is an interesting experience because you start out with very much these, what I would refer to as leader led rank advancements, right? So your leader is essentially doing nearly everything, for you or side by side with you, right
Mm-hmm.
up to the point where you get your eagle. And that is really a scout led rank advancement. And I don't think I recognized that so much when I was a kid going through that process. But as a father, working with my son to get his Eagle Scout, definitely recognize that the importance of mentors, to help you along the way until you become, you know, self-sustaining to where you realize, hey, I can do this. And it's just very much like having that coach or that
Yeah.
athletic trainer helping you push yourself past those natural limits, so to speak. But great experience in scouting, and something that certainly shaped my life, both as a young man as well as a parent, with doing that again with my son. So
That's cool. How old is your son now?
he's 22, in college, getting ready for law school, and just
Okay.
he's a great young man, and really proud of him.
That's cool. And the scouts that I have known that get to that eagle level are some of the most resilient people that I've ever been around. That can't be a coincidence. Would you agree with that with the folks that you've been around in the scout organization?
I would. It's a great organization, certainly taught me a lot, and something that, I'm just have a lot of gratitude towards. Scout leaders that I did have, the other boys in the scout troop. I mean, we had a lot of fun as well.
Yeah.
So
Well, so bring it back to kind of early adulthood. At what point did you start kind of planning adventure as a priority in your life?
yeah, well, I've continued to run. I think what I recognized early on is the importance of balance, right? So it couldn't be all about work. It couldn't be all about play either. Certainly recognized I needed to incorporate both. And so, I have had other interests in my life, whether that's, playing golf or skiing or those types of things. But, the time commitment was pretty significant. And, I found with running, it's something I could get up in the very early hours of the day, and I could mentally clear my mind and prepare myself for the day ahead. And so it became a habit or a daily ritual, so to speak, that, I get up very early and head out the door and get a run in. And it just,
What's early for you?
I'm ready to go by 5 a.m.
Yeah.
And so it's not, too crazy, but it's probably earlier than most. I don't see too
Yeah.
many people out there at that hour.
Yeah.
And again, I just think it set a foundation for me early on that, hey, I'm going to do this every day. And as I do that, it kind of helps the rest of the day go better, so to speak.
Yeah. Absolutely. How many miles a week do you run?
Usually around 30 to 35 right now.
Yeah,
So nothing too crazy. I have a couple of half marathons coming up in
where are
April
those
and
going to
May.
be?
And so, well, my son goes to school in Hawaii. And
Oh,
so
does he
I'm going to
really?
meet him. I'm going to meet him between his winter and spring terms. We're going to meet up on the island of Maui. He goes to school in Oahu, but we're going to go meet up in Maui. And then my May marathon is much less exciting. It's run out of Kansas City. So
Okay. A little less exotic.
yeah, yeah. And I should clarify, they're both half marathons, so nothing too crazy right now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, tell me, and you pick which one you want to go into, but of these, I forget now what you called them, the adventures and the groups that you do. You've
Yeah,
done about 6 of them. Give me an idea of some of the places that you've gone to.
yeah. So we've hiked. The first adventure that we did was Mount Whitney. It's the highest peak in the lower 48.
Is
I don't
this
know
when our
if you've
friend
hiked.
Steve broke his leg?
No, 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 no. It was not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steve has been
So
on the podcast as well and talked about
okay.
that experience, but
Yes. Yeah. So that was the one year that I actually did not go with the group, was when
okay.
Steve broke his leg. So
So that's why it
really
happened.
shattered his ankle. Yeah,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
preparing for that hike. But we the first one that I did was Mount Whitney. Beautiful setting. I believe we started again around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. The park rangers told us, "Hey, there are some bears in the area," but we went ahead and forged up the mountain. I'll never forget. We got up the mountain near the point of that hike where you cross from the east side of Mount Whitney over to the west side, basically, as the sun was coming up. Absolutely beautiful. It was cold. We were above 13,000 feet, so things move a
Wow.
little bit slower, but it was a gorgeous hike. And that at that point, I was really hooked on, continuing to do as many of these adventures as we could. The next hike that I went on, we went to the Grand Canyon, very different hike, but we did it right in the heat of the end of June. And so as we were hiking, it got hotter and hotter. On that hike, I realized the importance of preparation. We had some things happen on that hike that just really drove that home for me. But just again, just going back to making sure that you're ultra prepared, kind of going beyond what the actual event is going to entail. I thought was important. Then we went on to do a half dome in Yosemite.
Okay.
Not a physically challenging hike, mentally challenging from the aspect of going up the cable at the end of the half dome. So if you think of half dome as being like that North Face logo,
Mm-hmm.
the curved part there has a cable that you hold on to, and the dome curves away from you as you're hiking up to the summit. And it's just really learned the importance of staying focused on what you're doing as opposed to looking around at what others are doing or what else is out there, because mentally it got a lot harder for people. And the people that were, say looking side to side were actually coming back down because they said, hey, this is too much. I don't want to do this. But that was a great hike. We went on to hike Aspen's 4-pass loop and the Maroon
Yep.
Bells. I thought that was by far the most beautiful hike that we've done as a group. Although the 5th hike that we did together sounds ridiculous to say that about Aspen, because we were in the Napali coast
I
on the
thought I
island of
thought you did that.
Kauai.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was there
beautiful, beautiful hike.
this past summer.
Okay.
But drove up to the top. I didn't hike
Okay.
anywhere.
Okay, we started at a beach, hiked 13 miles in. Along the way in that hike, there's a point that's a couple thousand feet up from the ocean called Crawler's Ledge that's very, very narrow. And you hike out to another beach and turn around and hike back. Incredibly demanding physically. That was a tough hike. We were very fortunate. We didn't have much rain at all that day. Had a lot of people in our group that really that was a difficult hike.
Yeah.
The most recent hike that I've done with the same group is that we went up to Glacier and we hiked the Ptarmigan Trail out to Crosley Lake, which is just, it's incredible. It's so beautiful. The water is so blue. A relatively easy 27-mile out and back hike, if there is such a thing. So
Yeah, that's still a lot of miles. And even Napali and Glacier, you did those, and the Aspen 4-pass, you did all those as nonstop start to finish?
we did all those. Yes, we're all continuous. No camping involved, so to speak.
Okay. So was that near the Napali coast this past summer? The summer before that, we actually went out to Aspen and got to the base of the Maroon Bells and actually met a hiker that was finishing a weekend doing that pass. And I mean, I can only imagine what the views from the top look like, because the views from the bottom were unbelievable. So that loop is definitely on my list to try to pull off at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's gorgeous. And like you say, people would typically take 2 or 3 days to do that 4-pass loop. We did it in a day. Gosh, by the time we hit that 4th pass, it was that mile 21, so to speak.
Oh man.
I think physically and mentally, that was the part where that hike started.
Okay.
A lot of fun.
Now, is in any of these experiences, have you had a moment where you thought maybe you had pushed yourself a little too far, like whether you were unsure physically if you were in danger, or is there anything that comes to mind that maybe you had just taken it just a tad bit too far?
Yeah, absolutely. I did feel that way when we did the Napali coast because of the threat of that crawler's ledge. I felt, when the boats were stopping in the ocean and kind of pointing up at us as we were hiking, I was like, wow, they're pointing at us because we should not be doing what we're doing. And, as soon as we got to the beach on the other side of that hike, it was gorgeous, waterfall coming down. It was absolutely stunning. And at the same time, I had this sick feeling in my stomach because I realized we had to go back and get on the other side of that crawler's ledge before it started to rain. The crawler's ledge has some of that red dirt on it, so to speak, that is especially slick when it gets wet. So, having some experience hiking around Zion's National Park, I knew exactly what that red dirt was like when it's wet. And I was like, We have got to go. This is
Yeah.
gorgeous, but let's go. And I thought to myself, being on the island of Kauai where it rains often, that we have possibly made a bit of a mistake here because we hike these in a continuous day. None of us are prepared to stay overnight,
Mhm.
and there were a couple of points on that hike where I recognized people were struggling, but we had to continue to push through to make sure we can get on the other side of that safely. So outside
So
of
how,
that, we've had issues, with different individuals, on each of these hikes, honestly, as I look back. But, fortunately, we've had very good success. People have been safe and no major issues to report. So
how is that for you in the midst of that though, when there's someone that is struggling significantly, and like any group, you're only as strong or as maybe as safe as um the last person in the group.
yep.
So
It's
what is that
hard.
like for
It's
you?
hard because you are there helping another hiker, you're helping a friend, and at the same time you have to be very careful because you can't overextend yourself in doing that.
Mhm.
Otherwise you end up in trouble as well. So it's a very fine balance between how much help can I provide here and at the same time continue to remain safe so that you can get yourself out of the off the trail also.
Do you have, if you could rank those in your top, which would be your top three? How would you order that?
Yeah, I would order them, as follows. Four Pass would be number one,
Okay.
just gorgeous. Our only element of danger there was a lightning storm at the end, but otherwise we actually all fared very well on that hike. I would say number two would be Glacier, just because of the remote nature of that hike. It was stunning to get out to Crosley Lake, and as I was sitting on the shore thinking, very few people in our entire country have seen anything like this, right? It's a
I'm
grizzly
sure.
bear trafficked trail, so to speak,
Okay.
for 13, 14 miles in. And
Yes.
because of that, it's just a very rare thing to be able to see that. you know, and then I would say the Napali coast, just because the
Okay.
unique nature of that hike, being able to see the Pacific Ocean, essentially the entire time. Not one of my favorite hikes, but by far the most beautiful. When I look back, the Grand Canyon was neat, but we had some struggles physically with some of the members of our group that made that hike concerning to me.
Yeah.
And then Half Dome, the anxiety of getting up that cable, not being a climber, that was a new
Yeah.
challenge for me, right? That's
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
was out of my normal day-to-day comfort zone for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. With the Grand Canyon issues, were they significant enough that like you at points were worried about the safety of some of the members?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We had a couple of people that were sick from the heat,
Yep, that's
that of
easy.
course, keep in mind the mentality of our group was, as we were seeing the signs, the warning signs, don't do what you're about to do on our hike down into the canyon, that only fed our desire to do it more.
Sure. Yeah.
And so we had a couple of people really struggling with the heat that got sick. At one point we actually were very concerned, and the park ranger crossed our path at Indian Gardens there near the bottom of the canyon and was concerned about what we were doing as well, because it's just a bad idea to begin with to do this in a continuous hike, let alone at the end of June when the canyon kind of acts like a convection oven, so to speak, and
Oh
traps
my
that heat
gosh.
and keeps it in. I remember when he was upset with us, I looked over at the thermometer there and we were in the shade and it said 112. And I realized, okay, well, there may be a point to what he's saying here, that this was a bad idea.
Oh man, that sounds pretty gnarly. Now, unless you tell me otherwise, it sounds like you finished every one of these adventures.
Yep.
Is there a consistent theme or thread that you've whether it's discovered about yourself or just discovered in general about how adventure works? Is there something that has been consistent for you through getting to the other side of these adventures?
I would say it just goes back to that scout motto of be prepared, right? It's all in the preparation. I touched on that earlier, but I always like to think of when I have run a marathon or gone on one of these adventures, it's not actually about the day that you spend doing the adventure or running the race. It's about all the 5 a.m. starts,
Yeah.
even on Saturday, and waking up before everybody else, getting out there. That's where the race happens, right? Because when we actually get to race day, all the effort, 99% of it happens, well in advance of game day. So from my perspective, it's all about preparation, making
Yeah.
sure that we're ready for the challenges ahead.
And does
I
that,
think you see the same thing professionally, right? Doing what you
yeah,
do as an advisor. Retirement isn't about turning 65 and walking out the door and beginning that next phase of life. It's all about the decisions that have been made for decades going into
yeah,
that to make sure that you're prepared and ready financially to, you know, begin that next chapter. And that's
yeah.
the same thing with these adventures and the marathons that I've done, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's money or sport, to achieve any sort of goal, it has to be a long obedience in the same direction. Really, really unsexy, and it's, most of the time not a ton of fun. But you have to put the work in to get to the other side of it. And that's all, I think, a lesson that you can only learn through experience. I don't know that maybe some people could take that and metabolize it as in a lecture or hearing it from someone, but you have to do hard things to build that resilience and endurance to be able to do more hard things. I think I say that like I'm an expert. I'm not.
100%. Yep.
Yeah. So a couple questions to wrap up here. What has been your biggest challenge in trying to make these adventures a priority in your life? Has it been family or work planning, or what has it been that's been the hardest to pull this off?
If I'm being honest, Josh, it's myself, right? It's not
Mm,
the other things that are going on around me. It's just staying disciplined and making sure that I'm getting myself prepared for the event ahead. And I often find that I'm my biggest obstacle, right? I can come
yeah.
up with the rationalizations and the excuses not to do something or not to get out there, not to get out of bed, those types of things. And so I think, recognizing that has been important, right? Because these other things in life really not as big of a challenge as the ones that we create, between our two ears, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. You finished that thought with the idea of what's happening between the ears, because that's really something I've been interested in exploring these conversations. Is like I mentioned earlier, the body wants to give out far sooner than our capabilities would allow us. And I want to learn, I want to hear from people that are doing these hard things about how they take control of what's happening between the ears rather than being controlled by what's happening between the ears. And I love how you've kind of played back and forth with the framework that you learned in scouts to how that jumped into business, and then how that jumped back into adventure, and then how that jumps back into the challenges around running a very large company at this point. And I'm not sure how much of that has been intentional, but just as an outsider looking in, I see how that's played out within your life from the stories that you've told, which is really cool to hear, but inspiring from my standpoint to see that no thing has been left unlearned. Whether it's the suffering physically or just suffering through a challenge with work, you've been able to kind of leverage that into growth at all opportunities. At least, again, it seems from an outsider looking in.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I think so much of life is about mental toughness. My wife, she has a saying that, she reminds me of it often, which is, we can do hard things. And when things are difficult, I like to think of that. Just remind
That's
myself,
good.
I can do this. We can do hard things. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So let me wrap up with one last question. What do you have on the list that's still yet to come, other than the 2 marathon or half marathons that you mentioned earlier? What are some big things that you have on your to-do list ahead of you?
On my bucket list, so to speak, I want to be able to do an Ironman triathlon, right? With my
Yes.
swimming background, with my running. I am absolutely miserable on a bike, but I'm working at that. The things that just I have tried time and time again, but that is a weak point in my physical stamina, and something that I'm really working at, because I'd like to be able to get that off of my bucket list and say that I had accomplished that. Certainly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, there's some good ones. And you've got 2 of the 3 legs already figured out. So
That's right.
You're well down the road.
The funny thing is, winning in the pool is relatively short, the amount of time that provides you compared to getting on a bike or out on the run. The amount of time that you're actually in the water, it's quite a bit different. So the bike is a big thing for sure.
Yeah, they tell you, I've done shorter triathlons in the past, never anything that ultra distance, but they tell you that you can't win the race in the pool, but you can, or in the water, but you can lose it.
Survive the swim, right?
Yeah.
Just survive it. Yeah.
And I've got a buddy who's actually one of the first folks I interviewed for this, that he's a real estate guy here in Raleigh, that was a very competitive swimmer growing up. And in the last probably 10 years, he took that jump, say, yeah, I'll give triathlons a try. Well, he's also a really fast runner and got good on a bike, and has now, as of November, he qualified for the Ironman World Championships.
That's incredible. What a great story, though. Yeah, survive the swim and do your best on the bike. And if you're fast running, it's a plus, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of his race strategy, because he inevitably comes out of the water with mostly the professional triathletes. He's that good of a swimmer. So for the guys in his age group that he's competing against, he's like multiple minutes ahead coming out of the water. And then it's just kind of white knuckle and hold on for as long as he can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that'd be, if you go back and listen to any of the prior conversations I have, I think you'd really get a kick out of his.
I'll have to do that.
Yeah. Well, Eric, we're coming up on the time, and I have to say this has been a really fun hour for me, partly to catch up with you and hear how you're doing. But I got out of this exactly what I had hoped, and hearing from your experiences of what you've done, but not just the kind of the adrenaline piece of doing the thing, but what was it that led you to that point, and what did you discover on the other side? And what I heard you say is that preparation is key for all of it, and that's certainly what I'm going to take away from the conversation. So I really appreciate it.
Well, great. Well, appreciate our friendship, and the amount that I've learned from you over the years can't be overstated. So thank you so much.
Oh, cool. All right, Eric, we'll talk soon.
Okay, great catching up with you, Josh. Take care. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.